Good morning. My name is Douglas Griffin. This is my Sunday school lesson, my Sunday school Bible study. It is not going to have my mom singing, so if you tuned in for that, I'm sorry, but it's a great Bible study on Sunday mornings, so you'll enjoy it if you stick around. We are in the book of Genesis. We've been going through from the beginning, telling the story verse by verse. It's better to do it that way. You get the unbiased word, the unbiased word. A lot of times we bring our traditions, stories we've heard, things we've in different sermons, and we interpret scripture in a certain way. But when you go just verse by verse by verse by verse by verse, it's easier to see what God was doing, what He was talking about, and to get clarity on what God wants for our lives. So we're in the 34th chapter of Genesis, although I'm going to back up a little bit. Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has just had an encounter with his brother that he hadn't seen in 20 years. The last time he was around his brother announced to everybody that he was going to kill Jacob, right? Esau said, I'm going to kill Jacob as soon as my dad is dead. So Jacob went on the run, went up to Laban's, his uncle, and got married. Married Rachel, Leah, two of their maids. So he has four wives now. And 11 sons, one daughter. Well, one daughter that we know of. Her name is Dinah. He probably has other daughters, but they mention Dinah because of what's just about to happen to her in this chapter. So Jacob has met with Esau. They haven't seen each other in 20 years. Jacob was anticipating that Esau was going to kill him because that's the last thing he said. I'm going to kill you. Well, he didn't say it to Jacob. He announced it to everybody else. I'm going to kill him. So Jacob is anticipating that his brother is going to kill him. He's lined up his kids from the least important in his mind to the most important. He's put Joseph and Rachel, his favorite wife and favorite son, in the back. So in case Esau starts killing them one by one, Joseph and them can run. But instead of killing them, Esau shows up and embraces his brother and kisses him, and Jacob is shocked, although he shouldn't be because he had a wrestling match with the angel of God, and God was trying to prepare him for the situation. So Jacob hugs his brother, and Esau says, I want you to go, let's go back. He's assuming he wants to come back home. And Jacob says, yes, well, you go ahead of me. And he literally says, I'll meet you in Seir. Seir is a territory outside of Canaan that Jacob was conquering. He eventually is going to live there. So he says, I'll meet you there. So Esau heads on his way, and Jacob heads in the opposite direction. Lies to his brother because he's afraid to go back home. He just doesn't know what to expect there. Plus, he's crippled because he was wrestling with the angel, and the angel crippled him. His thigh bone is no longer connected to his hip bone. So he doesn't want his brother to see that. And he goes to a certain territory called Jabbok, and he stays there for about 8 or 9 years till he's totally healed. And then where we left off in Genesis chapter 33, verse 18, it says, then Jacob came safely, and a better translation would have been healed. The word shalom there that this is taken from has the connotation of healing and safety and peace and physical health and all of that. So he should say came healed, because that's how long it took that hip bone to heal, to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. So he finally crosses into Canaan. When he came from Padan Aram, which is where he was living with his uncle Laban, right up in Syria, that area. So now he's in Canaan, which today was modern day Israel. and he pitched his tent before the city. Now, Shechem, we've heard this term before. I was reminding you last time. In Genesis 12, verse 6, it says that Abraham passed through the land, talking about Canaan, to the place of Shechem. So when he came from Syria, because Laban and Abraham and all of them used to, they dwelled up in that land. When he came from Syria, the first place he stopped was Shechem. And he got as far as a terebinth tree of Moreh. So Moreh is a friend of his that he will make eventually, that Abraham made. And he had this beautiful terebinth tree. And it says, and the Canaanites were there in the land. And in verse 7 of chapter 12 says, then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants, I'm going to give this land of Shechem. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So this is the first time God had spoken to Abraham since he said, I want you to go and I'll tell you when to stop. So Abraham's just walking from Syria down into Canaan, which is modern day Israel. Finally, God speaks to him when he gets to Shechem and says, I'm going to give you this land. Now, 100 years later, Jacob goes to Shechem and says, oh, I think I will settle here, right? Not knowing this is the place where Abraham was. Just something said, stay here for a while. Okay. Later in Shechem, in Genesis chapter 37, when Jacob is looking for his sons, Joseph is with him, but the other 11 sons, well, no, at that time, does he? Yes, he does have 11 sons. Joseph and Benjamin, those only a baby, but so the other 10 sons are away, and Jacob's looking for them. This is a couple years later from this point. And it says, and Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them. So that's when he sends Joseph back up to Shechem, and then never he sees him again. Suddenly Joseph disappears, and the brothers come back with this story like, oh no, he was killed. And so Shechem becomes the place where Joseph disappeared. So it's the place where God spoke to Abraham. It's the place where Joseph disappeared. In verse 19 of Genesis 33, it says that Jacob bought a parcel of land where he had pitched his tent from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Now they didn't know what type of money, so they just said 100 pieces of money, whatever the money they had. He gave him 100 pieces of it. He bought land in Shechem. Turns out that Shechem is this guy's name. Hamor is his father, and he named the land after his son, called it Shechem. So that's going to give the son kind of an inflated opinion of himself. When somebody names a city after you, you think, oh, I must be something. My daddy named the city after me. And his family is there. Hamor's family is there, and Shechem is the oldest son, and everybody loves him, and they call the city Shechem. So instead of going back down to where his father's waiting for him, Isaac, Jacob says, I'm going to stay here for a while. And he buys a piece of land in Shechem from Hamor, right? Here's something else about Shechem. When the children of Israel had come back from Egypt 400 years from now, 400 years later, because you know that they all went down to Egypt, they stayed there for 100 years, and then God brought them back to this land. Again, Joseph, the place where Shechem is the place where Joseph disappeared. It says in Joshua 24:32, and we talked about this last week, so I'm almost done reviewing. It says the bones of Joseph. So they'd been there for 400 years. Obviously, Joseph had died 300 years earlier, but they had saved his bones because Joseph had saved their lives by being in Egypt when they needed food. And so they kept his bones. Like, oh, here. They didn't keep anybody else's bones. But the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem. Because that Shechem is it's the last place that they saw Joseph before he disappeared. And so they brought the bones back there in the plot of the ground which Jacob had brought from the sons of Hamor. This is Joshua 24:32. And also the last mention of Shechem, years later, about 1400 years later to be exact, and Jesus' time, Shechem is called, this region is actually called Samaria. And this particular city, Shechem, has the name Sychar instead of Shechem. And Jesus is traveling in the Samaria region. And in John chapter 4, verse 5, it says, so Jesus came to the city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, used to be called Shechem, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And now Jacob's well was there. So not only did he buy the land, he built a well there. He dedicated that land to Joseph, who disappeared. That's what, at least that's the story that the brothers gave. He was killed. And okay, so they don't want to admit that they sold their brother off to slavery. And so now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat by the well. It was about the 6th hour. And you know the whole story, the woman of Samaria who came. So we see Shechem mentioned several times in biblical history, but here's why it's really significant. I'll get to that in just a second. So he built a well there. He bought a plot of land there. It also says that he erected an altar there. In verse 20, again, we're just still in Genesis 33. I'm about to get to 34. In verse 20, it said there he erected an altar there and called it El Elohe Israel, which is God, the God of Israel. And Israel is the new name that Jacob had been given. And so sometimes the Bible calls him Jacob, sometimes the Bible calls him Israel, even after he'd been given a new name. And Jacob represented the untrusting side of him. Israel represents the trusting side of him. So whenever they're talking about the children of Jacob, that means you're not trusting God, you're not doing what God wants you to do. And whenever you're talking about the children of Israel, that means you've got this covenant with God and you're connected with God. So they still call them by both names. Did not do that with Abraham. Once Abraham became Abraham, they just called him Abraham. But Jacob still had two sides to his personality. It took a long time before Jacob became Israel, before he really changed and took on the personality of this new name. Now, just like Abraham, God called him Abraham 20 years before he ever became the father of many nations. So it took a while for Abraham to walk in the fullness of, see that manifestation. Because where Abraham means the father of many nations, and God was calling him that before he had any kids. So it took Jacob a while to really become Israel. And we're going to watch that time period, what was going on with Jacob while he was still struggling, while he was still wrestling, right? So here's something interesting that is where I ended last time, and I want to kind of dive into it. At the end of Jacob's life, he went down to Egypt, right? Joseph had been sold there into slavery. The family finally went down there. They didn't know Joseph was there. They were surprised to run into Joseph. And they finally convinced Jacob to come down to Egypt. And in Genesis 47, verse 12, it says, Pharaoh said to Jacob, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, this is Genesis 47, 12 and 13. Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. And that's what he considered life, as this journey. That's what we all consider life, this journey I'm on, right? We're not ever still in one place. You're on a journey that God's taking you on. So the years of my pilgrimage has been 130 years. Actually, compared to Abraham and Isaac, he was young because they died at 190, 180. He actually died at 140. He actually was 40 to 50 years younger than his dad and granddad when he passed. So he's considering himself young. I'm only 140. But at this point, he's 130. So he says, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. And they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. So it's interesting that he's looking back even at this point, even at your time, he's 130 years old. And he's still saying, my years have been few, because he feels young in comparison to, but he feels they've been evil. And I want to drill down into that because that affects how Jacob has been acting for a whole big long time period. He Jacob is looking at his life and thinking, nothing has gone right. I've not been in God's will my entire life. I've always been the victim of somebody else's treachery. And we can look at our lives that way and thinking, I am not where God wanted me to be. God had a different plan for my life, but that person messed it up. That person did something. And I'm not saying people don't do anything. I'm just saying they don't mess up God's plan for us. But we can think that. And that's what Jacob was thinking, that I was supposed to have lived with my parents, but then Esau got mad at me, so I had to run away to Laban. Like I was supposed to have stayed there. So now I ran right out of God's will, and I'm at Laban thinking everything's going great. I'm going to marry Rachel, but then he stuck me with Leah. He tricked me, and that wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to be married to Leah. I was supposed to be married to Rachel. Now he does marry Rachel eventually, but thinking Leah is the mistake, he had a certain opinion about her and her children. And he had a certain opinion about Rachel and her children. He had a certain opinion about Bilhah and Zilpah, the two maids. The only child that he thought he was supposed to have had was Joseph. That's why he treated Joseph the way he did. He gave him a coat and he just lavished him and loved Joseph and basically ignored his kids because he's thinking that's the mistake. That's not the will of God. I ran away from the will of God when I ran away from Esau, and then when Laban tricked me, I ended up with Leah, and that's not the will of God. And so when we think that we are in a situation that God didn't put us into, that's someone's mistake or someone's deceit, or then we never embrace the situation because we think I'm not supposed to be here. We're like how Jacob treated the rest of his kids. He just put them out there to be killed, and well, if Esau kills you, too bad, but I'm gonna protect Joseph. And he never embraced it, and we do that because we can look at someone else's treachery and think, oh man, that person shortchanged me, or that person disappointed me, and that's why I'm in a situation, and not understand that God turns everything for our good. There's no situation that we end up in that God can't rearrange so that it's for our good. If he allowed it to happen, even if it's based on somebody else's deceit or someone else's mistake, he still allowed it to happen, and he's going to make it work together for our good. Jacob never understood that. So he's always looking at Leah's kids thinking, those aren't my kids. He's looking at Dinah. Dinah was one of Leah's kids. That's not my daughter. That's just, that wasn't supposed to happen. And as long as we're thinking, I'm in a job, I'm in a city, I'm in a house, I'm in a car, I'm in a whatever relationship that I wasn't supposed to be in, and I'm outside of God's will, then we don't ever embrace it, because we have a will where the thing that we call our will is where we want something to happen. Oh, I hope that happens. And when it doesn't happen, we're disappointed. And we think God is the same way, that God wants this to happen, and then, oh man, that didn't go the way I wanted. That person didn't obey me, and that he's disappointed. And that's not how it works. There's not anything that happens that God is not in charge of. God's not hoping and like, oh man, you messed up. Mm-hmm. If he allows it, if he doesn't just strike you down, then he's got a plan already for that situation. Even if someone tricked you into it or whatever, he allowed it. So he's already ready to change that situation around for our good. In Romans chapter 8, Paul addresses this. So Paul is talking about creation, and he's saying the earth has been cursed, unfortunately, because of our disobedience with Adam. And so creation is groaning, waiting for this new heaven and this new earth that's going to arrive. And until then, we're kind of living under the effects of Adam's sin. He says our bodies are groaning, waiting for that we're all going to get new bodies in heaven, right? And walk around earth with our new bodies. But until then, your body is groaning. This isn't the original thing that God, the body he gave us was perfect, but because of our sin, Our bodies are we're separated from God, and so they're groaning, waiting for this new body. And Paul gives three different examples of things that are now subject to the curse because of our separation, because of Adam's sin and our own sin. But he says in Romans chapter 8, so then what shall we say to these things? Romans chapter 8, verse 31. If God is for us, who can be against us? Meaning, if so, do we say, oh man, this is not the body I'm supposed to have? This is not the. What we say is, well, if God is for us, then we win. We win. There's no one who can win against us. Now, he knows who's against us. The devil's against us. But who can win against us? No one. His will is still done in our lives. We still are victorious. In Romans chapter 8, starting with verse 28, he says, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. So all these things, even if somebody does something bad, even if Laban tricks you into marrying Leah, all that's going to work together for our good. To those who love God, to those who are attuned to God. Now, Pharaoh, for example, wasn't attuned to God. He was against God. That whole situation still worked out for Moses' good, right? And Moses still wins over Pharaoh. And God said, well, I'll use Pharaoh's rebellion and just to make myself famous. Everybody in the earth knows the story about Moses crossing the Red Sea and Pharaoh losing. So his rebellion I'll even use for my glory. But he didn't love God. So that didn't work out good for Pharaoh. He ended up drowning in the Red Sea. But for those who love God, if you love God, then you are walking in his purpose. All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called, according to his purpose. We're never out of his purpose. He has a purpose for everything that he allows. Again, even if you're in a situation that you didn't intend, God has a purpose for it. He's going to use it for your good. Jacob didn't get that. So he's looking at his kids thinking, I'm not supposed to have these kids. These are not my kids. That's that one kid, Joseph. That's the only one that's really mine. And that's the only one he paid attention to. So, sticking in Romans chapter 8, he says, for whom he foreknew, this is Romans chapter 8, verse 29. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. So what he means by foreknew, for those, God is able to look into our future, right? And he just turns his head because God stands in the center of time. So he turns his head and he sees 2,000 years ago. He turns his head and he sees 2,000 years from now. He sees it all. So he knows what choices we're going to make, who we are, what we eventually do. Even if we're rebellious and I hate God, he knows that we're going to finally surrender, give our heart to him, turn our lives over to him. So he knows in advance, he foreknows who he can trust, who ultimately will love him and who ultimately will hate him. And so he predestines that person. Okay, this person is going to end up, again, whether it's in your teens or in your 30s or 40s or your 90s, at what point you turn your life over to God, he then predestines what's going to happen and how he's going to use it. He has a purpose for you, a calling for you. And he makes all these things work together for good in your life because he knows he's going to use you. So for those he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. And what he, excuse me.
Wow.
So, what he predestines us to be is to be like Jesus. He's going to make all the circumstances in our life affect us so that we become more and more like Jesus, so that we become more humble and more giving and more loving. And, so all these different situations that he brings us into are slowly carving away our old man and creating that new man, allowing that new man to come out of us, right? So it said, moreover, in verse 30, those whom he predestined, these he called. So he has a call on us. And I back in the old day when I was a kid, after school, you'd be playing with your friends down the street, and then your mama would call you, hey, because there was no telephone, in your pocket and all that stuff. Come to dinner, right? And your mom's calling, and you could hear her voice. You could hear her voice. Like there'd be 8 of us playing, and each kid at a certain point would, wait, that's my mama. I didn't hear his mama's voice, but he knew his mama's voice. I heard my mom's voice. In fact, Jesus said, remember, my sheep know my voice, right? So you know your mama's voice in church, you know your mama's look. You can hear it above all else that's happening. And you know that dinner's ready. She's calling you because she's prepared something wonderful for you. Okay, I got to go. It's time to go to dinner. And that's how God calls us. He's got something wonderful prepared for us. So he calls us to it. I'm calling you to this destiny I have for you, this purpose I have for you. So those who he predestines, he called. And those who he calls, he says, he justifies, meaning he makes us righteous before God so that we can receive it, right? And so it doesn't matter how we've sinned, doesn't matter what we've done. In his eyes, he makes us eligible to receive all that he has for us, and then whom he justifies, these he also glorifies by giving us this new body and setting us in this new heaven and this new earth. That's the total plan that he has for us. But on this earth, he makes all these things work together for our good. No matter what anybody plans, no matter anyone schemes against us, no matter what mistakes we make. Oh man, I should have done that. God turns that back into plan A. In verse 35 of Romans 8, it says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Right? He lists all these things that might come against us. But he says, as long as God loves us, God is for us. Remember, who can be against us? As long as he loves us, we end up victorious. All these situations work out for our good. So in verse 37, yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. So God invented the concept of we win. We are conquerors. In every situation, we come out successful. We come out on top according to his purpose, whatever God deems as successful, because we may have a different idea of success. Success means I have $5 billion in the bank. Well, no, that's our idea. But it's God. We win in the situation. The devil doesn't win. The world doesn't win. That enemy that came against us doesn't win. We win. So we have to have that kind of attitude. Again, different than the world defining. It's not meaning that every time we run a race, we get first place. That's the world's concept of you win. God saying that you win because you end up in my purpose. You end up in what I planned for you. We don't end up out of his will. So we look back and say, okay, well, this is what happened. This is the place we ended up with, or this is the thing we ended with. So this must be God's purpose. God has a purpose that it ended up this way because we love him. We're trying to follow after him. And even though that person tricked us, or even that person came against us, or even, okay, I'm in the hospital, there's a purpose for it, right? We're the people who look for what's God's purpose, you know? Oh, am I supposed to witness to this nurse? Like, there's a purpose for everything. Somehow I come out victorious and God's will is done. Jacob did not believe that, getting back to the story. He did not believe that for years. He tells Pharaoh that my years of my life were few and evil. Like, meaning he thinks everything bad happened to him. At the age of 130, he looks back at his life and thinks, I never ended up where my son Joseph was killed, and I ended up marrying this person I wasn't supposed to marry, and my brothers met. And he looks back every instance of his life and thinks none of it was supposed to happen, and so he never embraces it. He never thinks this is God's will. Let me embrace this. This is what happened, So what's God's purpose in allowing it to happen this way? He's always thinking, nope, I'm outside of God's will. So he never embraces any of his kids except for Joseph. Now, we're in Genesis chapter 34, because that will explain plenty of what's about to happen. Genesis 34, verse 1. Now, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, now remember, he doesn't think he's supposed to have been married to Leah. I was tricked into marrying Leah. I don't love Leah. Leah named all of her kids, hey, Jacob, please love me. Basically, Reuben's name was, and this will make you love me. And that's his name, which is why Reuben was so mixed up, because Jacob never did love him. So that's like naming your child, you shall live in Mars. Well, I never did live in Mars, so my whole life is a lie. And that's how Reuben was messed up. So Dinah's just another one of Leah's kids. He doesn't like Dinah because he doesn't think he was supposed to be with. He never looked at that and said, this is what God did, so let me embrace these kids. No, never did. So now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had born to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. So they're in Shechem. She's out on an excursion. Jacob never went to her and said, take care of yourself and don't go out and, and I love you. He never gave her the tools to cope for the situation because he didn't talk to her. That's Leah's child. Verse 2, and when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her. So Shechem's the prince of the country. Remember, the city's named after him. So Shechem has this big ego. I am the shiznit. Okay. And so he's got this big ego. So he's prince of the country. He saw her, he took her and he lay with her and violated her because there are people who think I can just take whatever I want because I'm me and I'll just take her. And so he does. See? So he violated her. However, verse 3 says his soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. And he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. Now, this doesn't justify what he did. He did a wrong thing. But he also fell in love with her and think, oh, I'm going to marry her. So that doesn't make up for it. But he genuinely did fall in love with her. So verse 4, so Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, get me the young woman as a wife. Not, Father, would you please? But again, Shechem thinks he can have whatever he wants because that's what's happened his whole life. He was never taught to be a team player. He was taught, the city is yours. I've named it after you. Big ego. Joseph kind of had a little bit of the same problem too because Jacob just loved him so much, and that can be a problem when you shower. You can shower too much on your kids and give them the wrong warped idea of their value in this world and how people should relate to them. So he sends his dad out, and so Hamor heads up to talk to Joseph. In verse 5, it says, Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now, you probably heard this from Dinah's handmaidens that went with her down there, came back and said, ooh, let me tell you what happened. So it says, but now his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. So even though he heard what had happened to Dinah, he didn't say anything. Didn't say anything. And this didn't say anything is interesting to me. There's a couple of instances in the Bible where people got certain news and didn't say anything. So there's a couple of reasons not to say anything. There's a good one and a bad one. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, Saul has just been anointed king. And everybody's cheered. Yay, you're king. This is incredible, right? Cheering. And in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 26, it says, so Saul also went home to Gibeah. So he's on his way home after getting all this adulation. And valiant men went with him whose hearts God had touched. We love this guy and we're going to stick with him. He's our new king. It says, but some rebels said, how can this man save us? So they despised him and brought him no presents. They didn't kiss his boots and all that stuff. And, oh, you're wonderful. They made fun of him. He says, but he held his peace. Now, he could have, how dare you? But in this case, he didn't say anything, just like Jacob didn't say anything, because he's thinking, I'm going to prove to them later. I'll prove to them. So there's a time where you don't have to defend yourself. You're going to let your actions speak louder than words, right? I'll show them. So in this case, he's holding his peace because I'm going to prove to them. There will be an action that follows this. Now, Absalom also did the same thing, but his action was not good. In 2 Samuel verse 13, David's son Absalom has learned that his sister has been violated by his stepbrother, right? Amnon has violated his sister. And similar to what Jacob's sons are about to find out about their sister Dinah. So verse 21 of Samuel 13 says, but when David the king heard about all these things, he was very angry. Oh my God, look, my stepson violated my daughter. It wasn't his stepson, but it was his son by another wife, right? And so he's angry. Verse 22 says, but Absalom spoke to his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad. He held his peace. He didn't say anything. For Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. So he's thinking, I'm not going to say anything. There will be action later, but it won't be for his good. And we remember that Absalom ends up killing his stepbrother because he's still so angry. So in one case, Saul's holding his peace because I'm going to prove to them. I'm going to do so much good that I'll show them how wrong they are. Absalom's holding his peace because he's saying, I'm going to kill that man later and I'll show him how wrong he is. So, but in both cases, they're holding their peace because they're going to let their actions speak for them. In this case, with Jacob, he's holding his peace because he's totally detached. Whatever happens, happens. That's not my daughter. That's not what God intended. So he's not engaging. He's not engaging at all because he thinks that's not really mine. So I don't really need to do anything, whatever happens. So verse 6 says, then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. So now Jacob already knows what happened, but he's saying, hey, my son wants to marry you. Then in verse 7 says, and the son, not my son wants to marry you. My son wants to marry your daughter. So it says in verse 7, and the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, because those same maidens went out there and told them, guess what happened? And they were grieved and very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing which ought not to be done. So they felt that he had insulted Israel. They insulted their covenant, because whenever they say, because you'll see his name is Jacob sometimes in this verse, sometimes Israel, in the same verse. Jacob is the part of him that is not understanding what God is doing for him and is not connected with God. But Israel is the covenant. We made this covenant with God, and when you do certain things, you're disrespecting God. So they looked at it as you're disrespecting God, our covenant with God. And for example, in Joshua chapter 7, verse 15, God had told them to go to Jericho and let the walls come down, but don't take anything. Don't take any of their gods. But sure enough, somebody didn't listen. They broke the covenant. That's the Jacob side of them, right? The Israel side is we do what God says. So we all have an Israel side and a Jacob side. We're Jacob when we're breaking the covenant. We're Israel when we're trying to keep the covenant. So in Joshua 7, verse 15, it says, then it shall be that he who's taken with the accursed thing shall be burned with fire. So when God finds out, when I find out who it is, you're going to be burned with fire, which is very harsh. Why? Why? He says, and he and all that he has, because he has transgressed the covenant of the Lord. You're really slapping God in the face, he's saying. We've made a covenant with God. God told us specifically what to do. He brought the walls down. He did everything he was supposed to do. And then you're just going to spit in his face like that? You're transgressing in the covenant that we have with God, it says. And because he has done a disgraceful thing in Israel, it's the same language. You've done a disgraceful thing in Israel. You have disgraced God. So that's how they're looking at it. When you lied with my sister like that, you disgrace God, our covenant with God, and you're bringing shame on all of us. We've got to do something about it. Verse 8, back to Genesis chapter 34. But Hamor spoke with him, saying, listen, because I know you're upset, but the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife. Like, I know he did a bad thing, but now he wants to make up for it. And he offers him three things. Make marriages with us. So, here's three things that'll happen if you just forgive and forget. Then we'll all intermarry with one another, make marriages with us, give us your daughters to us, and you can take our daughters to yourselves. Number two, you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you, and dwell and trade in it. So you can live with us and trade with us, and we become prosperous that way, and acquire possessions for yourself in it. You can even acquire some land. Literally, that's what he's saying, acquire some land in here. So if you just let this go, we can become mighty because we'll join our families together. Verse 11, now Shechem says, so his father's been speaking for him. The son's been standing there. Now he speaks up. Then Shechem said to her father and her brothers, because he's trying to make up for it, let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me, I will give you. Ask me ever so much dowry and gift, and I will give according to what you say to me, but give me the young woman as a wife. So whatever I'll pay whatever price, because I'm the prince of this city. I'm the fresh prince from Shechem. But the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father and spoke deceitfully because he had defiled Dinah their sister. So they're about to lie. They're about to make a covenant with him and speak and lie. Now this and the author wants you to know that this is a bad thing, right? That this was not supposed to be their response. So even though they did this, this is not how God would have wanted them to do. In Hosea 10:4, it says, they have spoken words, swearing falsely and making a covenant. Thus judgment springs up like hemlock in the furrows of their field. In fact, I called this lesson a poisoned life. So because you're deceitful, because you are lying and making a deal with somebody and deceiving them in your anger, it says that hemlock, which is a poisonous herb, is going to spring up all over your field, in all the furrows of your field. And that's what it is when you allow this deceit and you're lying and you're dishonest with your brothers, that you're allowing this poison in your life. And it's going to poison you. And it really does affect them. It affects them ultimately. There's a reason why their brothers, all these brothers, ended up bowing down to Joseph in Egypt, and that they lost everything, and they lost their land. It was 400 years later that finally their families are going to come back to this land. But this is part of the curse that they brought on themselves, and why they had to leave Canaan for 400 years, because of their deceitfulness, what they're just about to do. This is poison. If they poisoned their own field and poisoned their life. So they said to him that they're lying now in verse 14. And they said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. So we can't just give our sister to you because you're not circumcised. But on this condition, we will consent to you. If you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and be gone. So now they're circumcised when they're 8 days old. As a little baby, they cut off a little foreskin, and that's a sign of the covenant between them and God. They're talking to grown men who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s and saying, we're going to cut off your foreskin. If only they had surgical equipment at this point, that would not be quite a problem. And anesthesia would have helped, but they don't. They have these huge, big broadswords that they had sharpened this on. Actually, I think in some cases they used rock. I forgot, because it's not the Iron Age yet. They used rock that was really sharp. So imagine, well, don't imagine it.
Don't go there.
Anyway, but he's saying you got to do this. Now they're appealing to Shechem's ego. If you want this daughter, then you got to all circumcise yourselves. So verse 18 says, and their words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. Yeah, Shechem said, oh, okay, I end up with her. Cool. So the young man did not delay to do the thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter, and he was more honorable than all the household of his father, which means he was respected. He was the most respected person. Not honorable like he always did the right thing. This means he was the most respected person. So if he shows up and says, hey guys, we need to do this thing, they're all going to go, okay, Shechem said it, and we'll all do it. Especially guys. Guys love to just give their will over to that one person who says, we should all go jump off the bridge. Yeah. So verse 20, and Hamor and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city, and they spoke with the men of the city, saying, now they're doing it in the gate, because the gate of the city is where everything happened. That's where everything was set up, right in the gate. Okay, so whenever you hear somebody say, and we stood in the gate, that's where the courthouse was, that's where everything was. So everybody's meeting there. These men are at peace with us, therefore let them dwell in the land and trade in it. Now he mentions two of the three things. He doesn't mention the third thing, like let them buy your land. But let them come and trade in it, for indeed the land is large enough for them. I mean, we've got enough room. It's just us, our family. Let us take their daughters to us as wives, and let them give our daughters. So we're going to intermarry, we're going to trade, right? Doesn't mention, and let them buy some of your land, but that's okay. Only on this condition will the men consent to dwell with us and to be one people. If every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. But look at the good part, right? Will not their livestock and their property and every animal of theirs be ours? I mean, we're going to intermarry. So we're going to joint own their cattle and their sheep. And this would be incredible. Only let us consent to them, and they will dwell with us. And all who went out of the gate of the city heeded Hamor and Shechem his son. Every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. Big sacrifice. So they're all going to be circumcised. No anesthesia, no nothing. Just let me take this rock and cut off your foreskin. Now, it came to pass in the third day, when they were in pain, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, died as brothers. Each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males, because they're all laid out. Right? They're all incapacitated because someone has cut off their foreskin without, and so they've been bleeding and there's bad stuff going on. So they can't move. And so two guys was able to go in and kill a bunch of people, Simeon and Levi. Why wasn't Reuben? So Reuben's the oldest. Simeon is second, Levi is third, Judah is fourth. So the second and third oldest sons of Jacob, his second and third oldest sons, they're leading it. Where's Reuben? Okay, later in Genesis chapter 37, we find out that Reuben does not like blood and killing. That's not his thing. Okay, so Genesis chapter 37, verse 22, when they had captured Joseph and they thrown him in the pit and they were going to kill him, they're all, yeah, we're going to kill him. Verse 22 says, but Reuben heard it and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into the pit which is in the wilderness and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. But he's like, ooh, I'm not into blood. I'm not into killing. Okay, because later he's thinking, I'm going to come back and deliver him, which actually didn't happen. Judah actually is the one that saved his life, which is very significant that Judah is the one that did it. We'll talk about it later. So, but anyway, Reuben's just not into killing people. Levi and Simeon are. They're crazed because they're so angry. So verse 26 says, and they killed Hamor and Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went out. So the sons of Jacob came upon the slain, and they plundered the city because their sister had been defiled. And they took their sheep, their oxen, their donkeys, and what was in the city and what was in the field, and all their wealth and all their little ones and their wives. They took captive and they plundered even all that was in the houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And since I'm few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me. I'll be destroyed, my household or not. Now, he doesn't yell at them and say, what you did was wrong. He's saying, what you did is going to cause me to get in trouble later. He doesn't say, what is wrong with you? You are evil. You are crazy. You went around and killed it. That's, You're going to make everybody mad, and they're going to come after me later. Now, interestingly, they didn't. In Genesis 35:5, the narrator of Genesis says, as they journeyed, the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So God presented them in such a way that people were afraid to go after them. But Jacob doesn't know that. He's just, they're going to come after us. And they didn't. But here's their excuse. But they said, should he treat our sister like a harlot? Now, I'm ending here because we'll take it up from here. It wasn't until years later that Jacob actually spoke to their evilness, because he finally became Israel and was able to see things how God was seeing them instead of just how they were going to affect him. So it was after he talked to Pharaoh and said, oh, my life has been evil. He had finally a change while he was in Egypt. And it was actually, he spoke to Simeon and Levi and let them know when he was blessing them. In Genesis 49:5-7, he says, Simeon and Levi are brothers, but their instruments of cruelty are their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their counsel. Let not my honor be united to their assembly, because they're crazy. For in their anger, they slew a man, and in their self-will, they hamstrung an ox. I'll explain that later. But cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath. So the curse on their anger and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. And he's saying their friendship is going to be divided. And when they get back to Israel, and this happened 400 years later, they'll be scattered. That's one reason why Levi didn't have his own place. God never gave Levi his own place. He gave Judah his own place, and Issachar and Dan. Everybody had their own. Levi didn't have their own place. The Levites were scattered among the people. He never gave them a place. And Simeon, when Moses prayed, didn't get his own plot either. He was linked up with Judah. So they never got their own place. And that's where the punishment finally came. And his father, Jacob, prophesizes this over them because he's finally able to address them like a father should. A father should say, hey, what's wrong with you? If you keep doing that, that's going to mess you up and blah, blah, right? He finally addresses them. But up until the end of his life, he never connected with them. He never stepped in and because he was just indifferent to them the whole time because he never embraced it and said, this is mine. These are my kids. I know was tricked into it, but if God let these kids be born, if God let this happen, then they're my responsibility. He has a purpose for it. This is my, God taught me to prevail. That was the whole point of wrestling to the angel. I'm changing your name from Jacob, one who's the deceiver, to Israel, one who prevails with God. You win. You are more than a conqueror. You've got to stop looking at yourself as Jacob, the deceiver, the person who only got ahead because he grabbed the heel of his brother, but as the person who prevails with God, who prevails with men. In these situations, don't look at yourself as a loser, but look at yourself as more than a conqueror. And that's how we all have to be. We have to look at ourselves. We are conquerors through Christ. We are conquerors in all that we do because God wins in the end, and his will is done. And if he loves us, then we know that it's going to work together for our good. That's what conquering means, that the situation that we are in, though it looks dire, will eventually work out for our good. And so we can embrace it as opposed to being indifferent to it and say, nope, here I am in this job I don't like, but let me embrace it because God has me here and there's a purpose and I'm supposed to be here. That job I lost, I wasn't supposed to have. Apparently I'm supposed to have this one. So I'm going to be faithful in it and do all I'm supposed to do as though I'm serving God. And then at some point, he'll promote me out of it to the next thing. But while I'm here, I'm going to embrace whatever situation I'm in and recognize that God has a purpose for me being here. I won't be indifferent or neutral, but I will embrace it. And that makes us conquer. That makes us understanding in all these things. We are more than a conqueror because God loves us. Okay, so we will go on from here next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I'll see most of you, hopefully, on Wednesday for the Wednesday night Bible study. We are in the book of Matthew. We are studying the cross, from the temple to the cross, the journey that Jesus took. And it's a fascinating journey. You'll enjoy it. All right. Amen.